Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is absolutely amazing to be with you this morning. And to start it out, I will introduce myself. My name is Susan Broderick. I am a woman in long-term recovery. For me, that means I have not had a drink since July 15, 2001. And what I'd like to do today is just to tell you a little bit of what it was like, what happened, and most importantly, what it's like now. So I grew up from, I don't know if you can tell, but I am a New Yorker. You'll hear it like when I say coffee. But I grew up in an Irish Catholic family, a lot of alcoholism. Both my grandfathers died from this disease, both my parents were alcoholics. My father was a construction worker, and I can still remember on Fridays, it was always hit or miss whether or not that car was going to be in the driveway. And if it wasn't in the driveway, that meant he was out drinking. And it used to create such anxiety in my stomach because this was around the time of the Brady Bunch, for those who, Mike Brady didn't drink on Friday nights. And so there was a lot of shame associated with my father's drinking. And then inevitably, he would get home at around 2 o'clock in the morning and fight with my mother. And so from a very young age, I hated alcohol. And I hated what it did to my parents. And then lo and behold, I was around 14, 15 years old, and my friends started drinking. And I started drinking. And I immediately loved it. And in fact, my nickname in high school was the Sponge. And now I look back and I'm like, well, that should have been one of the questions on like a 20 question thing. Do you have a problem with alcohol? And I just loved to drink. Now, the other thing that I have to mention is there was a shining light in my childhood, and that was my grandmother. My grandmother was one of the few non-alcoholics in the family, and she was also a woman way ahead of her time. She had been a single mom. She raised my dad and his brother and sister. She got involved in politics. She used to bring me down to Washington, D.C. when I was little. And from an early age, I was like, I just want to grow up and be a lawyer in Washington, D.C. And she was like, you can do it. You can do anything you put your mind to, Susan. And when you look at my family, my father hadn't even graduated high school. He had a GED. So we didn't come from a long line of attorneys. But she was just like, yep, you can do it. And so I went to college. Well, actually, my drinking in high school, everything turned to revolve around partying and my friends. And, that happens a lot during the teenage years. And then I went to college, and that was crazy. And actually, some of the worst parts of my drinking happened in college. I had transferred to the University of Albany when I knew that I was at Cortland originally, and we were drinking so much, I was like, I'm never going to become a lawyer if I stay here. So I transferred over to Albany. Problem is, I was still at Albany. My drinking followed me to Albany, and shortly after I transferred, I was at a party and passed out, blacked out, and woke up. And all I can remember now is that there were a bunch of guys, and I kind of went back into the blackout. And when I woke up the next day, it was at some big fraternity house. And I just remember going into the bathroom, and they had cut my hair. They cut the front of my hair. And, I look back at that, and it's like, oh my God, like that should have been the bottom. But in fact, I drank more after that. And at that time, there was no collegiate recovery. Nobody talked about getting sober. And I knew there was an issue that I had with alcohol. But I couldn't imagine life without it. And so the good thing is that I still could get good grades. And I ended up getting a 4.0 that semester that I was attacked. And I didn't talk to anybody about the attack. And I was fortunate enough, I went to law school, and in law school is when my nightly drinking started. Because it was like, oh, well, after a tough day of studying, I need to take the edge off. So I graduated law school, and I got a job at the Manhattan DA's office. Best job ever. But, of course, and this is what I always did, I gravitated to the people that like to play hard. So it was that work hard, play hard environment And I did both very well. At least I think I did. And the thing is, I didn't drink during the day. I didn't drink in the office. But I can tell you, I can remember days sitting in a courtroom on trial or, for arraignments or things and thinking, I can't wait to get home to my Chardonnay and my cigarettes. And during those years, it was this camaraderie and, and sometimes we were very inappropriate with each other and with colleagues and things. And I look back now at some of the things that happened then and it's crazy. And it really did take a toll on my reputation in terms of the things I would do when I was drinking were not the things I would ever do as a sober woman. And then more and more my friends started, settling down and getting married, and I'm like, oh, I'm not settling down, I'm a career woman. And the truth is I was a drunk who couldn't sustain a relationship. I would go out on dates, and then after about 2 or 3 dates, it was very clear to them that there was something up. So the calls would stop. But that wouldn't stop me from calling them, which I tended to do a lot after I was drinking. I'd just pick up the phone, call an ex-boyfriend, I'd just go down the list. They'd be on the other end like, how did I let this one get away? She's such a treat. So it was my life. And I was just like, well, this is who I am, and it's, how pathetic. So what happened is in January of 2001, I was getting ready for a wedding for one of my colleagues from the DA's office. And I knew that there were going to be a lot of very important people at this party. There were going to be a lot of judges and people that had worked in the office and gone on to higher public office. And I just remember being in the shower that day and becoming petrified. Because I knew that once I went to that cocktail hour, I knew once I had that first glass of wine, something started inside of me that I could not stop. And I just remember thinking, and it was that first moment that I truly realized I really was powerless over alcohol. And I kept thinking, I'm going to go there, I'm going to make a fool out of myself. And I did. I went to the wedding, I behaved completely inappropriately, went home with one of my colleagues, and the next day I got an email. And it was from the woman who had been in the DA's office with me and had become a judge. She was my mentor. And all the email said was, Susan, I think you have a problem with alcohol. And I hit delete because I was like, this is not acceptable. So a couple of months later, but it was good because it really was the beginning of me finally trying to contemplate how I would ever live my life without alcohol. Everything revolved around alcohol. So a couple of months later, I was down in North Carolina. My parents had retired to North Carolina, and both my parents had become sober. And I was watching television with my father, and out of the blue, he just said, you gotta stop drinking. And I'm like, I'm not drunk right now. And he said, I'm not talking about right now. He's like, nobody in our family should drink. And I just remember coming home from there thinking, he knows my secret. And it really wasn't a secret. I remember him saying later that, my phone calls at night, they would sometimes dread them because, I'd be slurring my words and they could hear the ice in the class. And so in July of 2001, I went down to Washington, D.C. It was the week of July 2nd. And I was going down for a conference at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So and professionally, actually, things were going really, really well. I handled sex crimes cases, domestic violence cases, homicide cases. It was actually after a big homicide case that Mr. Morgenthau had called me into his office and said, congratulations on that conviction, I'm going to put you in charge of child abuse. And I was like, that's a promotion? and I found my next 3 years as the Deputy Bureau Chief of Child abuse were actually 3 of the most important years of my career. Working with children was incredible. But again, it was sort of fueling that denial that I had to stop because it's like, well, look, I'm getting promotions at the Manhattan DA's office. And then I'd say, well, I haven't gotten a DWI, but I didn't have a car. So that kind of, that excuse fell flat. And so in July, I was down in DC, and I was at this great conference, and here I am in the city that I had always dreamed of. And all I wanted to do every night was go back to my hotel room, to the Chardonnay and the cigarettes. And I remember thinking, this is not who you dreamed of becoming as a little girl. And that Saturday was July 14th, and it was my father's birthday. So I called him before I left DC, and I had planned on doing sightseeing in DC before I took my flight. Of course, I was hungover, so I didn't get to do things I had planned to do. I called my father for his birthday, flew back to New York. First thing I did was go straight to the liquor store, because they're closed on Sundays, and you always have to have your stash of Chardonnay, at least if you're me. And went back to my apartment and started calling old boyfriends again. And that night, there was an old boyfriend. He must have been just as drunk as I was, because he came over. I don't remember much of the evening. I do remember that evidently he said that I was going on and on about, I've got to do something about my drinking. And then he stayed over, and the next day I remember he was leaving, and he said, I'll call you later. And I just remember thinking, he's not going to call me later. They never call me later. And he called me later. And he said to me, he hadn't seen me in 2 years. And he said, Susan, when I walked into your apartment last night, all I could think is, she used to be pretty. And I've never been gut punched before, but that was like the closest thing. You know, and it's a little embarrassing to say that was my bottom, and it really was like vanity that led me into AA, but it was a long time coming, and that was really just the straw that broke the camel's back. But so that day, I decided, I looked up online, and I found a meeting, and I went to a meeting, and I remember it was on the Upper East Side of New York, and I sat in the front. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was crying hysterically, and I raised my hand when they asked if there were any new people, and I said, my name is Susan, and I'm an alcoholic, and I felt like 10,000 tons were off my shoulder, because I was finally telling the truth, and it was something I knew intrinsically, but I had never wanted to admit. And the relief that came from that was unbelievable. And I walked out of the church that night, and I was crying, and I called my father. And he's like, what's the matter? And I said, I just went to an AA meeting. And he said, you don't have to give me another birthday present for the rest of my life. And I said, well, they told me I have to do 90 meetings in 90 days. I thought their mantra was 1 day at a time, and I don't know. And so he's like, well, I'll count the days with you, and he did. And that Friday, I went to a meeting, and it was in downtown Brooklyn. And they introduced the speaker, and they were like, and Charlie started his road to recovery in the Brooklyn House of Detention. And I'm like, oh dear God, I might have put Charlie there, and I don't want to be here right now. This is a little embarrassing. And Charlie got up and told his story. And very much like Andre's, I was sitting there and crying at the end of it. And I remember it was a Friday night, and I went up to him afterwards, and I said, you're a defendant, I'm a prosecutor, and we are the same. And we were hit with the same disease. And, you know, I did the 90 meetings in 90 days, and on my 57th day was September 11th, 2001. And I lived in Brooklyn Heights, and I saw the towers on fire. That afternoon, I went down to the promenade in Brooklyn, which is right across from downtown Manhattan. And the smoke was coming over, and the stench and the papers, it was awful, and we all know how awful it was. And I just remember, I was sitting on the bench, and crying, and I looked up, and I'm like, God, you lost me. And a few minutes later, I hear Susan, and I look up, and it was a woman from AA. And she said, I just checked with the church, and it's going to be open tonight at 7 o'clock. And I said, I'll be there. And she walked away, and I'm like, I'm back. So it was good. It was like, and the truth is, and that experience really was pivotal in my recovery, because I really did think about, like, what the hell would a drink do now? The only thing it would do is take away my 57 days of sobriety, and I've never had that. I've never had, since I was 15, I never went 57 days sober. And then it kind of became like a thing between me and the terrorists, but sometimes you need that fight, I was like, I'm not giving them my 57 days. That was my patriotic, duty. So, and I talk about the fact that, I got sober and then all the what hit the fan, because a year later, 4th of July weekend, 2002, I was on trial with a homicide case, a little girl who had been starved to death. And that weekend I came home and I had a big bunch of files with me. And evidently my front door didn't close all the way. Because about 6:15 in the morning, I felt something touching my chest. And I looked up and there was a strange man standing in my apartment. And I screamed, get the whatever out, and he got out, and then it was crazy because there was a beer bottle in the living room. So the poor cops that responded, I'm like, swab that for DNA, do this, I'm like leading the investigation into my own crime. But it came back, and it's a whole other story, but the DNA that was on that came back to an unsolved rape homicide. And, people talk about the fact that this disease, disorder, whatever you want to call addiction, that it'll eventually kill you. And I always said, well, it's not going to kill me. I drink and I'll just live a depressing life and call my old boyfriends, but I'm not going to die from that. Maybe die from embarrassment. But I realized that night, had I been passed out, had I not been able to respond the way I did, I would have been killed that night. So again, and that's what recovery has brought me, is that whole opportunity to look at a set of facts and find the good, because there's always good. My father was, he had emphysema, so in 2005, he was very close to his death, and I remember thinking, well, when he dies, I'll drink, because there's probably a dispensation. Like when you lose a family member, you get a day to drink, and then you get back on the wagon or whatever. And right before my father died, my mother had been diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer. So it was horrible, but it also provided me an opportunity to be the daughter that I wasn't as a teenager. And I was able to be there for both of my parents. And in fact, the night that my father passed, my mother couldn't stay at the hospital because she was going through chemo. And my father passed at 5:15 in the morning, and I was holding his hand. And I can tell you right now, if I had been drinking, I would have left that hospital at 11 o'clock at night so I could go home to my Chardonnay and my cigarettes and try to deal with my father's passing. And instead, I got to be with him the moment he took his last breath. And to me, that is so far the greatest gift of my sobriety. And then the following year, my mother was, she had her surgery. And then in 2007, I found out that I had breast cancer. So I, went for, and it was stage 1, it was early, had a lumpectomy, did radiation. The following year, the man that I was dating through AA was diagnosed with cancer, and he died 6 months later. And again, it was the AA community carried me through each and everything that I went through, and they were always there. And in 2009, I discovered something on my breast, and I went to 4 different doctors. And they were all like, oh, it's nothing, you're fine. And the last one said, it's probably scar tissue. And I said, you know what, I'm not a doctor, but probably is not a medical diagnosis that I'm comfortable with, so let's go for the biopsy. And he went for the biopsy, and it came back that it was in fact cancer. And, that night I was not jumping for joy. I was not seeing rainbows and unicorns. I was like, what did I do to make God so mean to me right now? And I called my sponsor, and she said, once again, I think the stars are aligned for you. And I was like, well, you're going to have to explain it because I'm not seeing it. And both times with the cancer, even the first time they told me there was nothing wrong and I pushed for more tests. And the second time, if I had listened to it's probably scar tissue, I probably wouldn't be here today. So she said to me, she said, how many people can say that they've saved their life 2 times? I'm like, But when you put it that way, it really is great. And again, that is what recovery is. It's that whole perspective change. It's looking at things from a positive outlook, because there always is something good in a situation. And each and every one of these difficult situations that I went through, I look back at them as they really were blessings in my life. Because every time I encountered something that I thought was so awful, so horrible, I got through it. And I got through it without a drink. I mean, I used to need 4 glasses of wine to go out on a date. And now I was getting through like September 11th, my father dying, all these things, stone cold sober. And it was the best feeling in the world. Because it was finally that feeling like, you know what, this is the woman I dreamed of being. And this is, sobriety has made me, has brought so many things to my life. And so I forgot this part, I did follow my dreams as well and moved to DC in 2003. And I was working for the National DA's Association doing child abuse work. Then I was the director of the juvenile justice programming. And then in 2008, I went over and I've spent the last 10 years at Georgetown University. I was doing juvenile justice work with prosecutors and judges all over the country. The last probably 4 years, I've really been gravitating more towards recovery and the justice system. And I feel like in many ways my professional and personal lives have really collided, and in a wonderful way. Back in 2013, I was at a meeting in Colorado with a group of prosecutors, and they were telling me about a program that they were working with in their drug court and in probation, and it was called Phoenix Multisport. I'm like, well, what is it? And they said, well, it was started by this guy, Scott. He got sober up in Boston. He was 24, came out of treatment, and he was like, what the heck am I going to do in my free time? So he started boxing, he started cycling, and he found that doing all of these activities not only helped him stay sober, not only helped him get healthier, but really helped change his identity going from an addict to an athlete. So he moved out to Colorado and just started asking people from 12-step meetings to go and do like hiking and doing all these great things. There was such support around this that he eventually created a nonprofit, and he called it Phoenix Multisport. And I'm like, this is brilliant. And I still remember sitting in the room texting my friends in New York. I'm like, we got to bring this all over the country. This is the most amazing thing. And it's that whole idea of using the leverage of the justice system to help point people in a positive way. Because I've never met anybody who decided to get sober or decided to get clean because things were going good. It's always a result of a consequence. And very often that consequence is an arrest or a referral to the justice system. And that's why what I'm trying to do now is to work with anybody who will talk to me in the justice system about finding ways to use that leverage in a way that we can hold people accountable, keep public safety as a priority as well, but then also use that leverage to help somebody get sober. Because that's good for public safety, that's good for the community, that's good for them, and it's good for their families, and it's good for everyone. So after I had heard about Phoenix, about a year later, I met with Scott, and next thing you know, I'm on the board. Now I'm the chair of the board, and this is not a promotion for Phoenix, I swear to God, it's just, this is how my life has unfolded. And so Scott and I have been talking about this whole idea of Phoenix inside and out. And originally it was, inside and out of the justice system. So we're working at diversion, working at drug court level, probation, but then also the hope is to be able to go inside facilities and start working with people while they're still on the inside. And we're actually doing this up in Boise. There's a women's prison, because now Phoenix is expanding all over the country. There's a women's prison there, and our members went in, spoke to the warden and said, we'd like to come in and bring yoga and other types of programming. So we're still working on the paperwork, but already, because they've met with the women, and women are already coming out and going right to Phoenix, because there they have a supportive community, a network of positive peers who are sober, they have the exercise, they have a sense of hope. And hope is used a lot in recovery because it honestly conveys that instrumental part. People need to believe that things are going to get better if they're going to stay sober. And that's part of it. It's like the initiation to sobriety, again, is very often because of a consequence or something bad. But if we're going to sustain our recovery, we need to fill that void. We need to, we take drugs and alcohol out of the picture, well, something else has to go in there. And when we start finding these activities that give us hope and joy and a feeling of meaning and purpose and a feeling that we're living the lives we were meant to live, then we stay sober. And I think the title for my talk today was The Reality of Recovery, because I feel like today especially, we hear about the overdoses, we hear about the addiction rates. We don't hear enough about the reality of recovery. The reality is that of all the disorders, the prognosis for addiction is actually very good. The majority of people who seek help for their addiction issues do recover. Maybe not immediately, sometimes there are relapses, but the majority of people who try to get sober do get sober. I'm currently working with a professor from the UK, and I came across his work last year. I was writing a paper called Love, Hope, and Random Drug Testing, because I was kind of pushing back a little bit on a lot of the people who were like, well, this is a disease, we can't arrest people for a disease, and I'm like, well, it's a little different than other diseases. Take it from me. I've had breast cancer and I've had alcoholism. My breast cancer didn't make me do the things my alcoholism did, and I did things that violated the law. I drove drunk, not in New York City, but on Long Island. But I did a lot of things, and there is a correlation between addiction and the justice system. So we cannot use addiction or the disease of addiction as a get-out-of-jail-free card, because it's not. And people have to be held responsible if they hurt other people because of their addiction. However, the fact remains that if we're not positive with them, we have that opportunity to point their life in a positive way. So when I was doing my research, I came across the work of a criminologist from the UK, and his name is David Best. And all he studies is the criminal justice system and recovery from addiction. And he has some amazing findings, and I'm happy to share them with your court people that are here today. But one of the most powerful studies of his was called the Second Chance Study. And it was a group of offenders who had pretty significant offending histories and had addiction issues as well. And the result of that study was that these people went higher than the control group, the people that didn't have those issues. And he talked about post-traumatic growth. And it's that whole idea that the adversities actually give people more strength, and you have more than you think you do. It's not, oh, look at what I've been through. It's like, look what I've gotten through. Look at what I have survived through. And he talks about the fact that with most other diseases or disorders, the goal is to get you back to where you were when you first came into the doctor's office. With recovery, you get better than well. You get to live the life that you were supposed to live. And I remember reading that study, and I got chills reading it, because I'm like, this is exactly what happened. And it's so true, and that's where, there's something so powerful just in sharing our stories, because if we've been through it, and it was the same thing when I had breast cancer. I didn't want to talk to the doctors. I didn't want to talk to the radiologist. I wanted to talk to other women who were on the other side of it, who could show me they got through it, they were doing okay, and that's how I got through it. And that's the exact same thing that my recovery did for me. So I made the big decision this year to follow my heart, and I left Georgetown, which my mother's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm following my heart again. She was nervous in 2003 when I'm like, I have to move to DC. She's like, why? I'm like, it was my dream since I was a little girl. She's like, you don't know anybody there. I'm like, it'll be fine. So this year, I decided that, so I created Building Bridges to Recovery. And it's in honor of my father, because he was an iron worker and he built bridges in New York City. And my goal is to bring hope to the justice system, because I truly believe that the justice system plays one of the most major roles in addressing this, and that the justice system can provide more recovery, more hope to people, and to realize that this is nothing to be ashamed of, and that recovery, The decision I made on July 15th, 2001, to this day, is the best decision I have ever made in my life. And if there's anybody new in this room, or anybody who is feeling a little despondent, just stay in the middle of it, keep going. It's easier to stay sober than to get sober. And the woman that was the speaker at my first meeting, her name was Claire, and she was celebrating 25 years of sobriety. And I'm sitting in the front crying, and she talked about a life beyond her wildest dreams. And I was sitting here this morning, and I'm like, it's true. I mean, the fact that I am here today and I can share my story with you and help you in any way that I can, it's a gift. And it just confirms to me that this is what I'm supposed to be doing now, and this is my purpose. And so thank you for having me here today. And I want to help anybody that I can and help make sure that we're doing what we can in the justice system to turn lives around in a really positive way and support those families as well. So thank you so much.